Lindsay Shively, Introduction to Public Speaking. Speech 2, Ceremonial Speech. Growing up in a rural area in the 1980s and 1990s, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was one of the few things on television that my parents allowed me to watch. As a child, I enjoyed the different aspects of his show, especially the various friends that he met and when he fed his fish. I think one part of the show we would all remember is when he changed his shoes. A fun fact about his shoes is that the reason he wore tennis shoes is because they were less noisy when he roamed around the set than normal dress shoes. He wanted the focus to be on what he had to say, who he was meeting, the projects he was completing, and not the sound of his shoes. While I didn't necessarily admire Mr. Rogers at that time, I did, however, come to admire him. In the next 6 to 8 minutes, I will be honoring Mr. Fred Rogers, covering why I admire him for improving the lives of young children for so many years, and probably for many years to come. Fred Rogers was born on March 20th, 1928 in Pennsylvania, which is where he ultimately passed away on February 27th, 2003 of stomach cancer. Mr. Rogers received his bachelor's degree in music composition at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida in 1951. He also attended the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where he received a Bachelor's of Divinity degree and became an ordained Presbyterian minister. He then attended the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development, which he graduated from in 1963. Mr. Rogers made his first appearance on camera in 1963 on a CBC program called Mr. Rogers, which aired in Canada. He had said that he hated the content of television shows on during that time. He thought he could use TV to provide an avenue for a more wholesome and productive show for children and families to watch. Fred and his wife decided to move back to Pittsburgh because that is where they wanted to raise their 2 young sons. There, the Eastern Educational Network used segments of the CBC program and turned it into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and it first aired on PBS in 1968 and continued to air new episodes until 2001. When PBS was developing, Mr. Rogers gave a speech to a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate in 1969 and single-handedly managed to up PBS's funding from a likely $10 million to $20 million. Mr. Rogers once said, "Anyone who does anything to help a child in his life is a hero to me." And that is exactly what I believe Mr. Rogers was. A hero to many young children. He helped many young children through Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to learn about the world around them. The world can be a very scary place to young children, but with a safe and calm place to talk about real life issues, children learn that it's not so scary after all. Each one of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood's episodes explored a theme that is real to young children, and it offered affirming messages to help young children work through their fears and worries about those themes. This is why I admire Mr. Fred Rogers and the work he has done with young children. Mr. Rogers was more than a television star. He was a husband, father, vegetarian, had a strong faith in God, and so much more. Mr. Rogers' widow, Joanne Rogers, expressed that Fred would have liked to find someone who could take over Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but he was never successful at finding anyone to do that. In 2008, the PBS Kids Next Generation Media Advisory Board was put together to help find curriculums missing from the PBS lineup. They turned to the Fred Rogers Company to help develop a curriculum that was specified for social and emotional development. Together they came up with the show Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which is similar to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in that it shares many of the same characters, such as Daniel Tiger, and this is Daniel Tiger from Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and it deals with real life issues and human emotion. Mr. Rogers' legacy lives on through the Fred Rogers Company, which is responsible for more recent shows such as Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which I just mentioned, Peg and Cat, which helps children work on math and similar math concepts, and The Odd Squad, which is very similar to Peg and Cat in that it works on math skills and concepts, but it is geared toward older children. Everyone, no matter who they are, can learn something from Mr. Fred Rogers. One of my favorite quotes that illustrates his far-reaching impact is, "There are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind." I admire his dedication in all of the aspects of his life. However, I have chosen to magnify his dedication to children and their overall health and education. This is important to me because I myself believe in the spirit, future, and lives of children. Mr. Rogers educated children, parents, and others on character and what it meant to be a good person. He did this through his TV shows, appearances, through books, and other avenues. I admire Mr. Fred Rogers not only for providing me with entertainment as a child, but for his gentle and sweet words that have advocated for children for years. His values live on today in his books and will for generations to come. He was a true advocate for children and genuinely cared for them. This speaks to my heart, and Mr. Fred Rogers is who I admire.